Dr. Deaver, good evening.
Thank you.
Welcome to our interview with Dr. Deaver, a grandfather of biblical archaeology. Today we will explore his career and his views on intersection about Bible and archaeology. Through your distinguished career in biblical archaeology, which discovery or project do you think has been the most significant and why?
Well, it's not the big discoveries that are important, it's the accumulation of knowledge over a long period of time. I suppose the Solomonic Gate we excavated at Gezer has garnered the most publicity. That controversy is still going on. But again, it's not the single discovery that really is important in the end.
Given your middle ground role in debates about biblical archaeology, what's some common misunderstanding about your view?
Well, everything in archaeology is controversial. No matter what you say, you offend somebody. So I've been involved in controversy all my life, all my career. And I suppose I thrive on it. I think most people think either I'm trying to prove the Bible or I'm trying to disprove the Bible. Neither is true. I've always tried to hold to a middle ground, but when you do that, you get it from both sides.
So your transition from being an evangelical preacher to you call yourself a secular humanist, how has that personal journey of yours influenced your view of the biblical archaeology and your scholarship?
Well, I grew up with the Bible. My father was an evangelical pastor, as I was in my youth. I went to seminary to study Old Testament and learned a little about archaeology, but then I discovered biblical theology. And at that time, the most prominent biblical theology specialist in America was George Ernest Wright, and he had just moved to Harvard. So I applied to Harvard to do biblical studies. I wasn't interested in archaeology at all. I thought I was going to be a theologian. And I discovered the first year at Harvard, the first semester, in fact, that while I had the dogmatic temperament, I didn't have any real talent and I went to Ernest and I said, "This is not for me. I'm going to drop out." He said, "Well, why don't you try archaeology? Maybe you will like it. Come with me to Shechem this summer." And after I'd been there about 2 or 3 weeks, I talked with Ernest again, and he said, "This is what you're going to do for the rest of your life." And he was right.
He was definitely.
So I don't know, if it hadn't been for Ernest Wright, I probably would have been a pastor in some small town somewhere. But from the beginning, it was my love of the Bible. But I thought of it in terms of theology. Then I came to think of the Bible in terms of history. And the rest, as they say, is commentary.
In your opinion, what is the most groundbreaking idea or theory about biblical archaeology today? And how does it shape our understanding of ancient Israel?
Well, archaeology is changing very rapidly. And in fact, if you heard the papers today, the change and the rate of change is astonishing. The question is, where do we go from here? I'm fascinated by that. I won't live to see these changes. But archaeology is changing so rapidly, I don't think you could make any predictions, except maybe it will continue in one form or another. The question is whether we Americans will continue to have a major role in Israel or anywhere else in the biblical world. For me, that's the question. And it all comes down to students, to the next generation. So what those students will be like, I don't know. For me, it was always about history, a better understanding of history, trying to understand what it was like to live in those times for most ordinary people, to live with the Bible and the way the Bible came to life. And that's what I'm still trying to do. But there will be a new generation with new approaches, which I barely understand. I'm glad that some of my students will be among those pioneers, but they have to find their own way, as I found mine. I had thought that perhaps the only approach to archaeology, even if you call it biblical archaeology, was a secular approach. I wanted to separate archaeology and biblical studies, not to do away with biblical study, but to try to find a partnership in which the two could talk to each other. So I hope that dialogue will, well, I can't say continue, it never really started. And for me, that's a disappointment. So the kind of lifelong vision I had for a lively, vigorous, well-supported American secular archaeology, that vision is fading. And what will happen now, and I'll be candid, I look to evangelicals because you have the kind of interest and commitment to the Bible and to the biblical worldview that I had. So let's see what you can do with it. It's your turn. It's not mine any longer.
So debates with your fellow archaeologists, particularly Israel Finkelstein, are well known. How do you feel those debates shaped the modern biblical archaeology?
Well, in my judgment, the debate is over.
Okay.
From the beginning, Finkelstein, by the way, we grew up together, and we've argued for 30 years and enjoyed it for the most part. Of course, his low chronology seemed to prevail for many years. We Americans never followed it, and many Israeli archaeologists didn't either. But he always said, wait till you see the carbon-14 dates. Well, we waited, and we have seen them. And to make a long story short, the most recent and most secure carbon-14 dates all favor the conventional chronology. So I'm not even sure the low chronology is worth debating anymore. Finkelstein is retired like me. He's also ill. We haven't heard much from him recently, but I think that long debate, which distracted us for 30 years, is over. And to put it simply, I think we won. And it's very interesting. The scholars who won that battle, and it is won, were in some cases liberals like me, secularists. Others were very conservative, evangelicals, some of my own students. And of course, Gezer turned out to be a prime site again. So I'm glad to see that that's over. And if it had come out in another way, I would have accepted that. But in fact, the traditional view of the 10th century and the rise of the Judahite state, which Israel always opposed, that war is over.
So looking forward in future, because the debate is over, what do you see as the biggest challenge and opportunities for the next generation of biblical archaeologists?
Well, theoretically, you can talk about the challenge of doing interdisciplinary archaeology and all that sort of thing, and cyber archaeology, as we heard about today. The real challenge is to find support for it. Okay. Frankly put, our universities and seminaries are no longer interested in traditional biblical archaeology. And if we don't manage to redefine it, it will not survive. So we are fighting for the life of a discipline to which some of us gave our whole lives. And it comes down to a question of support. And that's why what Mark Lanier is doing here is so absolutely critical.
So would you say that we had more funding in the past, like when you were excavating?
Oh, yes, absolutely. My program at the university was closed. It was the largest program in the world, and the number of speakers here are my students, I'm glad to say. But it was closed by the dean because I wasn't making money.
Oh.
It's all about money. It's all about STEM today: science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The humanities disciplines everywhere are suffering. Religion departments are closing. Whole universities are closing. And AI will change all of this in 5 years or less. So the challenge, in a word, is simply to survive.
Okay, I've read a book about from Noah Harari, and he talks about that archaeologists have the least amount of chances to be replaced by the AI. So there's some kind of...
Well, I don't know. I know his work very well. I've read all of his work. If anybody knows something about the future, it is he. But I don't think archaeology is any safer than the other humanities. There was a chart published recently in Harvard Magazine that did a survey of about 30 different fields according to what young people applying wanted to do. And at the very bottom came departments of religion, next to that departments of history, and at the top, computer science. And in fact, there were more people entering college, university today, interested in computer science than all of the other disciplines put together.
Wow.
So that's what we're up against. It may simply be that our universities no longer care about what we do. We don't have a home. So there are there are wonderful people interested in archaeology, but unless we can create new jobs, maybe in new institutions, we don't have much of a future. That's why what's happening at Lipscomb is so important. And I'm honored to have trained those two students, but they know much more than I know about what's going on. The future is theirs.
So what is one thing that you wish about, let's talk about general public. What is one thing you wish the general public would better understand about the work of the biblical archaeologist?
Well, of course, the first thing would be to understand enough to care.
Okay.
Because ultimately we're dependent on what students want to know and what the general audience wants to know. And somehow we have to justify archaeology. It's no longer enough just to be curious about the past and to want to investigate this and that and the other thing. We have to believe that understanding the past is a matter of life and death. I can't help but think, while we're here talking about the future of archaeology in Israel, about the future of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
The Israel that I know, in which I grew up, is gone. The whole point of doing archaeology is to learn something from the mistakes of the past.
Mm-hmm.
If we don't, we will repeat those mistakes. And I have to ask, is it possible that if we archaeologists investigating the past had done our work better, all parties would be better off?
Mm-hmm.
We should have learned that violence is not the answer, that we have to learn to work together despite our differences. If we don't learn that, we're doomed.
Yes, when I teach my students, they always ask me why we study history. I said, because if you don't study history, you're going to repeat the mistakes.
If we don't know where we've been, we have no idea where we're going.
Correct.
So that's the challenge, to keep that question alive and to interest enough people to make some difference. Archaeology is still one of our best tools for understanding who we are as humans in this world.
Correct. And do you think that we have politicized archaeology, especially in Israel?
Yes, to a certain extent, we have always done so, but less so than elsewhere. Okay. Most Israeli archaeologists are not, they're nationalists, of course, they're Zionists, they're patriots, but they're doing simply honest, good work, which is what we have to try to do. Mm-hmm. Let's stop trying to prove this or that and gather new data. Mm-hmm. And to interpret the data intelligently and honestly. That's our only hope. But it's a hope not yet realized. So I don't think we can take the survival of archaeology in Israel or anywhere in the Middle East for granted. We really have to be willing to reassess what we've been doing and to have the courage to do that. I'm going to try to say that tomorrow. Okay. I grew up that way with a sense of duty. Mm-hmm. We have a duty.
Well, let's talk about legacy. So how do you hope your work and your contribution to biblical archaeology will be remembered and utilized by future scholars?
Would you believe me if I say I don't really care about legacy? I never think about it.
Yeah.
My legacy is not a shelf of publications, those will be forgotten. My legacy is my students, and that's why I'm here to support them. Mm-hmm. And that's why I appreciate Mark Lanier's support. It is so crucial. That's the only legacy that matters to me. I never wanted to be famous. I never wanted to be recognized in particular. The way I grew up, I was taught to do good work.
How do you hope your work and the contribution to biblical archaeology will be remembered and utilized by future scholars?
Well, of course, you publish your views. I have certainly done that. And you hope things you've written will be read by the next generation. But it really is all about students. That's my legacy. I retired from fieldwork before I was 60 and decided to devote the rest of my life to teaching because that seemed to be the future. And I'm so proud of what my students are doing. None of them are doing exactly the work that I did. They found their own way. I'm proud of the fact that the harshest criticism I've ever had in print comes from my own students because I taught them that way.
Mm-hmm.
And it's so good to be here with them and to hear them say good things about my work, of course. That's nice. But it was never about me. It was about new ideas, about honest inquiry. And the questions for me were always moral questions. And my students understand that. And they're carrying on the tradition. That's what matters to me. It's an immense satisfaction that they're doing so well. For me, at 90, it's all over. And this is probably my last public appearance. I don't like to go out anymore. But I wanted to come here because there was one last task to do.
Who was your greatest inspiration and influence in your journey throughout the world of biblical archaeology, and how did they shape your approach to your work?
Well, my parents, first of all.
Okay.
My parents instilled in me a sense of duty. We never talked about it. We didn't need to. If it was there to be done and you had any ability to do it, you did it. And that, I hope, has characterized my whole life. In terms of other individuals, certainly George Ernest Wright was my mentor in every way. Without him, I wouldn't be in the field. He saw in me something I didn't see in myself. And I tried to do the same with my students. I tried to find qualities of which they might not have been fully. And from the beginning, I almost knew which students would do what. And I've rarely been disappointed. The relationship between a teacher and students is a sacred relationship. And for me, the greatest satisfaction in my life, not awards I've won, not things I've published, my students.
So would you, for your students, I know several of them, but did you see that Dr. Ortiz is going to follow you together?
Did you
see that Dr. Ortiz went together for 10 years?
Well, yes, he went in a way to correct my work, to supplement it, which he has done wonderfully well. And I couldn't have been more supportive. So again, look, if your students don't turn out better than you fail. So I've always rejoiced in the success of my students. And they have been brave enough to differ with me, certainly so. But it's that dialogue that has been the greatest satisfaction of my life. And of course, I have to be grateful to my family, to my wife, my children, and my grandchildren now. But to be here and to listen to my students is a joy I can't describe.
Well, thank you, Dr. Deaver, for your insightful thoughts today. Your contributions to the biblical archaeology are truly invaluable.
Carry on the tradition.
Thank you very much.